What if everything happening right now is not random at all? What if the ground collapsing beneath cities, the sky forming impossible shapes, and the ocean revealing hidden structures are not separate events, but parts of a single pattern we do not yet understand? Across the United States, something deeply unusual is unfolding. Not in a single region, not within a single scientific domain, but across multiple systems at once. In California, entire sections of land are giving way without warning, with cliffs collapsing into the ocean and hillsides sliding in slow, unstoppable motion. In Florida, sinkholes are opening beneath neighborhoods, sometimes swallowing roads, sometimes destabilizing homes that once stood on what appeared to be solid ground. In Texas and parts of the Midwest, storms are exposing layers of land that have not been seen for generations, revealing buried structures, unusual geological formations, and in some cases, objects that raise more questions than answers. Along the Pacific coastline, marine ecosystems are behaving in ways that seem disconnected from known seasonal patterns, with deep-sea organisms appearing near the surface without clear triggers such as storms or temperature shocks. Individually, none of these events are unprecedented. Each one has a scientific explanation, grounded in decades of research and observation. Reports from the U.S. Geological Survey consistently document the mechanisms behind sinkholes, particularly in regions with limestone bedrock, where groundwater slowly dissolves the rock and creates underground voids. Similarly, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has published extensive data on coastal erosion, rising sea levels, and shifting ocean currents, all of which contribute to changes in both land stability and marine life behavior. For example, NOAA data shows that certain parts of the U.S. coastline are eroding at rates of several feet per year, while USGS estimates that thousands of sinkhole-related incidents occur annually in high-risk regions like Florida. But the core issue is not whether these events can be explained individually. The real question lies in their simultaneity. These are systems that operate independently, governed by different physical processes, different timescales, and different environmental triggers. Geological instability, atmospheric phenomena, and marine behavior are not supposed to align in a synchronized pattern. And yet, that is exactly what appears to be happening. When multiple independent systems begin to show signs of stress, change, or instability within the same narrow window of time, the conversation shifts. It is no longer about isolated causes. It becomes about systemic convergence. This is where the narrative changes, because synchronization implies something deeper than coincidence. It suggests that there may be underlying connections not yet fully understood, or that multiple systems are responding to a shared set of pressures that we have not fully identified. In complex systems theory, this kind of behavior is often associated with systems approaching critical thresholds. Small changes accumulate quietly, often unnoticed, until they begin to manifest across different layers of the system at once. What we are seeing may not be a series of unrelated anomalies, but the visible surface of a much larger process unfolding beneath our awareness. To understand what is happening beneath our feet, we need to look at the mechanics of sinkholes and land subsidence in more detail. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, most sinkholes form in regions with soluble rock, particularly limestone, gypsum, and salt beds. Over time, groundwater moves through these materials, gradually dissolving them and creating underground cavities. This process is not dramatic. It does not produce noise, shaking, or immediate visible warning signs. Instead, it unfolds slowly, over years or even decades, as water continuously reshapes the subsurface environment. The ground above remains intact for as long as it can support its own weight. But eventually, a critical point is reached. The support fails, and the surface collapses, often suddenly and without warning. In Florida, one of the most studied sinkhole-prone regions in the world. USGS data shows that these collapses can occur in areas that have shown no prior signs of instability. Homes, roads, and entire sections of infrastructure can be affected within minutes. What is particularly unsettling is not just the speed of the collapse, but the invisibility of the process leading up to it. For years, nothing appears to change. The ground feels solid. Structures remain stable. Life continues as normal. And then, in a single moment, everything shifts. This creates a powerful paradox. Stability, as we perceive it, is not always a reliable indicator of actual structural integrity. A system can appear stable on the surface while undergoing continuous degradation beneath. When applied beyond geology, this idea becomes even more significant, because the same principle can be observed in other complex systems. Environmental systems, economic systems, even social structures often experience long periods of hidden stress accumulation before any visible disruption occurs. What we are witnessing in these ground collapses may therefore be more than just isolated geological events. They may be physical manifestations of a broader pattern. A reminder that systems do not fail at the moment they break. They fail long before, in ways that are not immediately visible. The collapse is simply the point at which the hidden process becomes impossible to ignore. This perspective changes how we interpret the timing of these events. If sinkholes are appearing more frequently, it may not be because the process has suddenly started, but because it has reached a stage where its effects can no longer remain hidden. And if similar patterns are appearing in other systems at the same time, it raises an important question. Are we witnessing multiple independent processes reaching their breaking point simultaneously, or are these systems somehow linked by deeper, shared pressures? While the ground beneath us reveals one kind of instability, the sky above presents another set of anomalies that are equally difficult to ignore. Reports of luminous spheres, hovering lights, and unusual atmospheric formations have been documented for decades, often categorized under rare electrical or plasma-based phenomena. One of the most studied among these is ball lightning, a phenomenon that has intrigued scientists for centuries. Research published through the American Physical Society suggests that ball lightning may be the result of complex plasma interactions, potentially involving vaporized materials and electromagnetic fields created during lightning strikes. Under controlled or observed conditions, most recorded instances of ball lightning occur during storms. They are typically associated with high electrical activity, strong electromagnetic fields, and unstable atmospheric conditions. This aligns with current physical models, which rely on energy input from lightning or other high-energy processes to sustain these luminous structures, even if only for a few seconds. However, the phenomena described in the events we are examining do not fully align with these conditions. Witness accounts consistently describe clear skies, calm air, and an absence of storms. No thunder, no lightning, no measurable electrical disturbances. And yet, objects resembling ball lightning appear, move, and disappear without leaving behind the expected environmental signatures. This creates a gap between observation and explanation. It is important to approach this gap carefully. A lack of explanation does not automatically imply a supernatural cause. Science is built on the recognition that current models are incomplete and subject to revision as new data becomes available. What these events suggest is not that the laws of physics are being broken, but that our understanding of certain atmospheric processes may still be limited. There may be mechanisms at play that are not yet fully understood, or conditions under which known phenomena can occur outside their typical environments. At the same time, there is another layer to consider: human perception. The way we interpret what we see is influenced not only by the physical characteristics of the phenomenon, but also by context, expectation, and prior belief. A glowing sphere in the sky can be interpreted as plasma, as an unknown aerial phenomenon, or as something symbolic, depending on the observer. This does not invalidate the observation, but it does shape the narrative that emerges around it. What makes the current situation particularly compelling is not just the existence of these lights, but their apparent alignment with other anomalies occurring on the ground and in the ocean. Once again, we are faced with the same pattern: independent systems, different mechanisms. And yet, events appear within the same window of time. When science can partially explain a phenomenon but cannot fully account for its context, its frequency, or its conditions, it signals an opportunity for deeper investigation. Not a conclusion, but a question. And when those questions begin to appear across multiple domains at once, they point towards something larger than any single event. As the instability on land and the anomalies in the sky begin to form a pattern, the next layer of this unfolding story emerges from a place far less visible, yet far more stable over long periods of time. The deep ocean has always been one of the most consistent and controlled environments on Earth. Governed by pressure, temperature gradients, and slow-moving currents that change over centuries rather than days. It is a system defined by isolation, darkness, and equilibrium. And yet, reports have begun to surface describing deep-sea organisms appearing near shorelines, not injured, not disoriented in the way one might expect, but simply present in places where they do not belong. These are species adapted to extreme pressure, often thousands of meters below the surface, where sunlight does not reach and environmental conditions remain remarkably constant. Their sudden appearance in shallow waters challenges not only expectations, but the underlying assumptions about how stable the deep ocean truly is. According to research and observational data from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, unusual marine behavior can sometimes be linked to shifts in ocean temperature, disruptions in deep-sea currents, or geological disturbances such as underwater seismic activity. Changes in thermohaline circulation, for example, can alter the vertical movement of water masses, potentially bringing organisms from deeper layers closer to the surface. However, these processes are typically gradual, localized, and tied to identifiable environmental triggers. What makes the current pattern difficult to fully explain is not the existence of such mechanisms, but the scale and timing of the observations. These appearances are being reported across different coastal regions within a relatively narrow window of time, suggesting that the underlying cause may not be isolated to a single location or event. This raises a more complex possibility. If multiple deep-sea ecosystems are responding simultaneously, then the trigger may exist at a larger systemic level. The ocean is not a collection of separate bodies of water, but a connected global system where disturbances in one region can propagate across vast distances. Large-scale shifts in temperature distribution, salinity, or pressure gradients could create cascading effects that reach even the most stable environments. And if those effects are strong enough to influence species that typically remain isolated from surface conditions, then what we are observing is not simply a biological anomaly, but a signal of a deeper transformation. There is also a conceptual shift that occurs when we consider the ocean in this way. For most of human history, the deep sea has represented what is hidden, what is unknown, what exists beyond direct observation. When elements of that hidden system begin to surface, it changes not only the physical landscape, but the way we interpret boundaries. The separation between surface and depth, between known and unknown, begins to blur. These events suggest that the barriers we assume to be stable may, under certain conditions, become permeable. And when that happens, what was once contained begins to appear in places where it was never expected to be seen. At this point, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. The ground reveals what has been weakening beneath it. The sky presents phenomena that challenge current models. And now, the ocean, perhaps the most stable system of all, begins to show signs of change that reach from its deepest layers to its surface. Each of these on its own could be studied, explained, and categorized. But together, they form a progression. From below, to above, to beneath again. A sequence that suggests not randomness, but unfolding. As natural systems begin to show signs of instability and change, another category of events begins to emerge. Not from physical processes, but from the uncovering of the past. Reports of submerged structures, carved stone formations, and inscriptions resembling ancient writing systems have sparked intense debate. Some of these discoveries appear in regions where, according to current historical consensus, no such advanced construction should exist. Others include symbols and scripts that bear resemblance to Proto-Semitic writing, a system historically associated with early Middle Eastern civilizations, not with pre-Columbian North America. These claims, by their nature, are controversial, and they immediately challenge established timelines of human migration, cultural development, and technological capability. According to research and public statements from the Smithsonian Institution, there is currently no credible scientific evidence supporting the existence of ancient Semitic civilizations in North America prior to known historical contact periods. Archaeology, as a discipline, relies on verifiable context, carbon dating, stratigraphy, and reproducibility of findings. Without these, extraordinary claims remain unconfirmed. However, what is particularly important in this context is not simply whether these discoveries are validated or dismissed, but how they are received. When an observation appears to contradict established knowledge, the response often follows a predictable pattern. It is either rejected quickly as an error, a misinterpretation, or a fabrication, or it becomes the starting point for a deeper investigation that may eventually reshape understanding. History provides multiple examples of ideas that were initially considered impossible. The existence of deep-sea hydrothermal vents, for instance, was once unimaginable until direct observation proved otherwise. The theory of continental drift faced decades of skepticism before becoming the foundation of plate tectonics. In each case, the limitation was not the phenomenon itself, but the framework used to interpret it. This does not mean that every unusual discovery is revolutionary, but it does mean that the boundary between accepted knowledge and unknown possibility is not fixed. It evolves as new evidence emerges and as interpretive models improve. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. Human perception is not purely objective. It is influenced by expectation, cultural context, and prior belief. When people encounter objects or structures that do not fit into their existing framework, the mind attempts to reconcile the discrepancy. This can lead to overinterpretation, where patterns are imposed onto ambiguous data, or underinterpretation, where anomalies are dismissed too quickly. In the case of these archaeological reports, both dynamics may be at play simultaneously, creating a space where certainty is difficult to establish. What makes these discoveries particularly relevant within the broader narrative is their timing. Just as physical systems are revealing hidden instability, the ground itself is also revealing objects and structures that were previously buried. Whether these findings ultimately confirm new chapters of history or are reclassified within existing frameworks, they contribute to the same overarching theme. The hidden is becoming visible. Layers that were once inaccessible are being exposed. And as those layers come into view, they challenge not only what we know, but how we define what can be known. At this stage, the pattern extends beyond natural systems into the realm of human understanding. The Earth is not only shifting physically, but also revealing fragments of its own past. The question is no longer limited to geology or atmospheric science. It becomes broader, more fundamental. When both the natural world and the historical record begin to surface new information at the same time, it forces a reassessment, not necessarily of what is true, but of how complete our current picture really is. As the pattern continues to unfold across land, sky, and ocean, another category of anomalies begins to demand attention, not because of their scale or intensity, but because of their precision. In multiple regions across the world, including parts of North America, Africa, and Australia, observers have documented the appearance of near-perfect circular formations etched into landscapes that otherwise show no sign of deliberate design. These formations vary in size, sometimes spanning several meters, sometimes extending across entire fields. Yet they share a defining characteristic that is difficult to ignore. Their symmetry is not approximate. It is strikingly precise. Edges appear clean. Boundaries are clearly defined. In some cases, the interior remains barren, while the surrounding area supports vegetation, creating a visual contrast that enhances the geometric clarity of the structure itself. Similar observations have been reported in oceanic environments, where circular light formations appear above water or just beneath the surface, maintaining consistent shape and proportion in ways that challenge typical fluid dynamics. At first glance, science offers partial explanations. Nature is not devoid of geometry. On the contrary, it is filled with it. Honeycombs form hexagonal patterns due to efficiency in packing. Crystals grow according to molecular structures that dictate symmetry. Fractal patterns appear in coastlines, clouds, and plant growth, reflecting recursive mathematical principles embedded in natural systems. In the case of desert formations known as fairy circles, research published in Nature suggests that these patterns may arise from competition between plants for limited water resources. As vegetation organizes itself spatially to maximize survival, it creates gaps that, over time, develop into circular formations. This explanation accounts for localized cases, particularly in Namibia and parts of Western Australia, where environmental conditions are relatively consistent. However, the challenge emerges when similar geometric patterns appear across different environments that do not share the same ecological constraints. When circles of comparable symmetry are observed in regions with different soil compositions, different climates, and different biological systems, the localized explanation becomes insufficient. It does not break down completely, but it no longer explains the phenomenon as a whole. Instead, it suggests that we may be observing different manifestations of a deeper organizing principle, one that is not yet fully understood. In complex systems science, such patterns can emerge from self-organization, where local interactions give rise to global order without a central controlling force. But even within that framework, the level of precision observed in some of these formations raises questions about scale, consistency, and timing. Timing, once again, becomes a critical factor. These formations are not only appearing in multiple locations, but they are doing so within overlapping time frames that draw them into the broader pattern we have been tracing. When geometry emerges in isolated systems, it can be studied as a product of local conditions. But when similar geometry appears across disconnected systems within the same period, it suggests that those systems may be responding to shared underlying dynamics. It is not necessary to assume intention or design to recognize that such alignment is statistically unusual. Even within stochastic systems, where randomness plays a role, certain patterns become less likely as the number of independent occurrences increases. This is where the distinction between randomness and pattern begins to blur. Randomness, by definition, produces variation without predictable structure. Yet what we are observing here is not variation. but repetition. Not identical in every detail, but consistent in form, consistent in symmetry, and consistent in emergence across environments that should not be directly influencing each other. When randomness produces order once, it may be coincidence. When it produces order repeatedly across independent systems, it becomes something else. Not necessarily intentional, but not purely random either. From a broader perspective, these geometric anomalies reinforce a theme that has already begun to emerge. Systems that appear stable begin to reveal hidden dynamics. Boundaries that seem fixed begin to show permeability. And structures that should be irregular begin to exhibit unexpected order. Whether these patterns are the result of undiscovered physical principles, emergent behaviors in complex systems, or limitations in our current models, they point toward the same conclusion. Our understanding of how large-scale natural systems organize themselves is incomplete. And when that incompleteness becomes visible across multiple domains at once, it signals a moment not of certainty, but of transition in understanding. As the narrative moves from physical structures into the realm of perception, another layer of complexity emerges. One that does not rely solely on measurable data, but on interpretation, cognition, and meaning. Reports of luminous crosses in the sky, human-like figures formed in light, and radiant presences captured in places of worship introduce a different kind of anomaly. These are not just events that can be measured in terms of distance, temperature, or energy output. They are experiences. They exist at the intersection of external observation and internal interpretation. And because of that, they are often more difficult to categorize, more difficult to verify, and more difficult to dismiss. Psychology provides an important framework for understanding how such perceptions can occur. The phenomenon known as pareidolia describes the brain's tendency to recognize familiar patterns, especially faces and symbols, within ambiguous or random visual data. Studies published by the American Psychological Association demonstrate that this tendency is not a flaw, but an adaptive feature of human cognition. The ability to quickly identify faces or meaningful shapes in uncertain environments has survival value, even if it occasionally leads to false positives. From this perspective, seeing a human figure in light or a cross in the sky can be understood as the brain applying familiar templates to unfamiliar stimuli. However, this explanation, while valid, does not fully resolve the phenomenon, because what makes these events significant is not only the shapes that are perceived, but the contexts in which they appear. These sightings often occur during moments of heightened emotional or social significance, religious gatherings, periods of crisis, times of collective attention. In these contexts, perception is not operating in isolation. It is influenced by expectation, belief, and shared meaning. A light in the sky is not just a physical event. It becomes a symbol, interpreted through cultural and psychological frameworks that give it significance beyond its measurable properties. This does not mean that the phenomenon is purely subjective. The light itself is often recorded, captured on video, or observed by multiple individuals simultaneously. What varies is not the existence of the stimulus, but the interpretation of it. One observer may see a natural optical effect. Another may see a symbolic message. Both are responding to the same input, but through different cognitive filters. This duality creates a space where scientific explanation and symbolic meaning coexist, not in opposition, but in parallel. What becomes particularly interesting is how these symbolic interpretations begin to align with the broader pattern we have been examining. Just as geological systems reveal hidden instability and ocean systems reveal hidden movement, perceptual systems reveal hidden frameworks of meaning. The human mind is not separate from the environment in which it operates. It is part of the system, and when multiple layers of that system begin to shift at the same time, perception itself can become more sensitive, more reactive, and more inclined to find meaning in what it observes. There is also a feedback loop at play. As reports of these phenomena spread, they influence expectation. As expectation changes, perception follows. And as perception changes, new reports emerge that reinforce the pattern. This does not invalidate the experiences. Instead, it demonstrates how information, belief, and observation interact within complex systems. The result is a phenomenon that is both real and interpreted, both external and internal. In the end, the question is not simply whether these symbolic light phenomena are real in a physical sense, but what role they play within the larger pattern. Are they independent anomalies shaped by human perception, or are they part of a broader shift that includes both physical and cognitive systems? When the environment changes, perception changes with it, and when perception begins to detect patterns that were previously unnoticed, it may not always be because those patterns were not there before. It may be because the system as a whole has reached a point where they can no longer remain hidden. As the pattern extends from land to sky to ocean, and even into perception itself, a deeper principle begins to emerge. One that connects all of these layers into a single underlying mechanism. It is not a force, not a single event, and not something that can be easily observed in real time. It is a process defined not by sudden chaos, but by slow accumulation. Across geology, climate, oceanography, and even social systems, there exists a recurring dynamic in which change builds gradually, often invisibly, until it reaches a threshold beyond which the system can no longer maintain its previous state. At that point, what appears to be a sudden shift is not the beginning of change, but the moment it becomes visible. This is the pattern that has quietly shaped some of the most significant transformations in Earth's history. And it is the same pattern that may now be unfolding across multiple systems at once. According to assessments from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, many of the Earth's natural systems do not respond to pressure in a linear way. Instead, they exhibit non-linear behavior, meaning that small, incremental changes can accumulate over time without producing immediate visible effects until a critical threshold is reached. This threshold is often referred to as a tipping point, a boundary beyond which the system shifts rapidly into a new state that may be difficult or impossible to reverse. Examples of this behavior can be found in melting ice sheets, shifts in ocean circulation, collapse of ecosystems, and even changes in atmospheric patterns. In each case, the process leading up to the tipping point can span years, decades, or even centuries, while the transition itself can occur on a much shorter timescale. This framework provides a powerful lens through which to interpret the events we have been examining. The ground does not collapse at the moment it begins to weaken. It collapses when the accumulated weakening reaches a point where structural support fails. The ocean does not suddenly change behavior without cause. It responds to gradual shifts in temperature, salinity, and pressure that eventually alter its internal dynamics. The atmosphere does not produce anomalies without underlying conditions that make them possible. Even human perception does not shift randomly, but in response to changing contexts, information, and collective awareness. In each case, the visible event is the result of an invisible buildup. What makes the current situation particularly compelling is the possibility that multiple systems are approaching their respective thresholds at the same time. This does not require a single cause affecting all systems equally. It is enough that each system has been accumulating stress independently, influenced by its own variables, until those stresses begin to manifest in overlapping time frames. When that happens, The result is not a single dramatic event, but a convergence of many smaller ones, each emerging from its own domain, yet collectively creating the impression of a coordinated shift. From a systems perspective, this convergence can create a powerful illusion. It may appear as though events are happening simultaneously without warning, when in reality they have been developing for a long time beneath the surface. The warning was always there, but it was distributed, subtle, and easy to overlook. A slight increase in erosion rates, a gradual warming of ocean layers, minor anomalies in atmospheric behavior, small inconsistencies in observational data. Each one, on its own, is not enough to signal a major change. But together, they form a pattern that only becomes recognizable when viewed at scale. This is where the concept of irreversibility becomes critical. Once a system crosses its tipping point, returning to its previous state is not simply a matter of reversing the conditions that led to the change. The system itself has reorganized. Feedback loops that once stabilized it may now amplify the new state. In climate science, this can be seen in processes such as ice albedo feedback, where melting ice reduces reflectivity, leading to further warming and more melting. In ecosystems, the loss of key species can trigger cascading effects that permanently alter the structure of the environment. In geological systems, the collapse of a structure cannot be undone by restoring the conditions that existed before it fell. The system has already transitioned. When we apply this understanding to the broader pattern, the question becomes more complex. If land, ocean, atmosphere, and perception are all showing signs of change, are they independent systems reaching their thresholds by coincidence? Or are they interconnected components of a larger system undergoing a collective transition? The Earth is not a set of isolated subsystems. It is an integrated whole, where changes in one domain can influence others through feedback mechanisms that operate across scales. Climate affects ocean currents. Ocean currents influence weather patterns. Weather patterns shape geological processes. And all of these, in turn, influence human perception and behavior. This interconnectedness means that tipping points are not always isolated. One system crossing its threshold can push another closer to its own. A change in ocean circulation can alter atmospheric dynamics. Atmospheric changes can influence precipitation and erosion. Erosion can destabilize land structures. And as these processes unfold, they create a cascading effect that amplifies the overall sense of change. What we perceive as multiple independent anomalies may, in fact, be the visible edges of a network of transitions propagating through a connected system. There is also a temporal dimension to consider. Human perception of time is limited. We tend to focus on immediate events, on what changes from one day to the next. But many of the processes that shape the Earth operate on timescales that extend far beyond individual experience. When those processes accelerate or reach critical thresholds, they compress long-term change into short-term observation. What would normally take centuries to become visible may now appear within a single generation, or even within a few years. This compression creates the impression of suddenness, even when the underlying causes are anything but sudden. In this context, the phrase, "everything is happening at once," becomes less a literal description and more a reflection of how these processes are being perceived. It is not that all change begins simultaneously, but that multiple processes have reached the stage where they become observable within the same window of time. This distinction is subtle, but important. It shifts the focus from coincidence to convergence, from randomness to pattern, from isolated events to systemic behavior. At this point in the narrative, the pattern is no longer confined to a single domain. It spans geology, oceanography, atmospheric science, perception, And now the dynamics of complex systems themselves. Each layer reinforces the others, not by proving a single explanation, but by demonstrating that the same underlying principle appears across different contexts. Slow change, invisible accumulation, threshold crossing, sudden manifestation. This is not a new pattern. It is a fundamental characteristic of how complex systems evolve. The question, then, is not whether change is occurring. That much is clear. The question is where we are within that process. Are we still in the phase of accumulation, where most changes remain hidden? Or have we reached the point where multiple systems are beginning to cross their thresholds, making the invisible visible? And if the latter is true, what does that imply about what comes next? Because in systems that operate through tipping points, the most significant changes do not occur gradually. They occur after the threshold has already been crossed. All of these events can be explained, at least individually. The ground collapses because of erosion. The lights appear because of rare atmospheric physics. The ocean shifts because of temperature and pressure changes. But here is the question that remains unanswered. What if the real story is not in each explanation, but in the pattern they form together? What if we are not witnessing isolated anomalies, but the early signs of a system quietly reaching its limit? And if that is true, then the most important question is no longer what is happening, but whether we are paying attention before it becomes impossible to ignore. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video even a little interesting, I would truly appreciate it if you could give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for watching until the end.